The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the rubble of Cologne as Oberlieutenant Wilhelm Bartleborth gripped the cold steel of his Panther tank's commander's cupola. Through his periscope on that fateful March 6, 1945, he began counting the approaching Sherman tanks, but stopped at 12 when more emerged endlessly from the smoke and dust like mechanical phantoms. His gunner, Unteroffizier Gustaf Schaefer, called up from below with a voice cracking in disbelief, asking how many tanks the Americans could possibly possess. The acrid smell of burning oil and cordite hung heavy in the air as Bartleborth climbed down from his turret, his boots hitting the broken cobblestones of what had once been Cologne's thriving commercial district. Around him sat the remnants of Panzer Brigade 106 Feldherrnhalle, 17 Panthers, 9 Panzer IVs, and 38 half-tracks, all reduced to static pillboxes not from battle damage, but from empty fuel tanks. Through the morning haze, he could see the American assembly area near the cathedral, where the enemy hadn't even bothered to camouflage their vehicles. They sat in the open like a motor pool on a peacetime Sunday, with mechanics casually performing maintenance and crews brewing coffee on small stoves mounted on their tanks. The metallic clink of tools on armor echoed across the ruins, while hundreds of Sherman tanks, tank destroyers, and self-propelled guns stood lined up in perfect roast-like products fresh from an assembly line. Bartleborth's brigade had started Operation Watch on the Rhine with 89 tanks, but after 3 months of combat, only 26 operational vehicles remained. The Americans in front of him had reportedly lost 23 Shermans that morning alone, yet continued advancing as if the losses were meaningless. His adjutant, Oberfeldwebel Karl Zimmermann, surveyed the scene through captured American binoculars and counted aloud 217 tanks in this sector alone. Zimmermann lowered the binoculars, sweat beading on his forehead despite the March cold, reporting they were bringing more across the pontoon bridges. As his men watched the American armor marshal for the final push into Cologne's city center, Bartleborth walked among the abandoned German vehicles, calculating that the Americans had more tanks in this single square kilometer than the entire 5th Panzer Army had received as replacements in 6 months. Standing among this display of industrial might, watching American tankers casually smoking cigarettes atop their vehicles, a crushing realization settled over him. If the Americans could afford to concentrate such numbers for a single city, then this war was already over. 4 months before Bartleborth's revelation at Cologne, in November 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had presented the Führer with a report that should have ended all offensive operations immediately. German tank production had peaked at approximately 1,800 vehicles in December 1944, a remarkable achievement considering the bombing of factories and shortage of materials. However, the numbers told a story of inevitable defeat, as Allied intelligence estimates indicated the United States was producing tanks at a rate that dwarfed German output, while the Soviets manufactured even more. The Allies were reportedly producing over 4,000 tanks monthly, while Germany struggled to build 150. The Third Reich was attempting to wage mechanized warfare with artisan production methods. The sound of hand files and hammers still echoed in German tank factories where workers hand-fitted parts, with each tank requiring specialized adjustments. Major Friedrich Steiner of the Wehrmacht's Ordnance Department had calculated that it took tens of thousands of man-hours to build a single Tiger II tank. Meanwhile, at the Chrysler-Detroit Arsenal, the assembly line never stopped moving with its mechanical rhythm of production, stamp, weld, rivet, repeat, continuing 24 hours a day. By March 1945, American factories had produced approximately 49,000 Sherman tanks, with thousands more manufactured as variants, sending roughly 8,000 to the Soviet Union, while equipping the entire British armored force and still having enough to replace every tank lost in combat within days. Wilhelm Bartleborth was not a fool. At 34, he was one of the most experienced tank commanders in the Wehrmacht, holder of the Honor Roll clasp, veteran of Kursk and Normandy, where he had learned that in modern warfare, quantity had a quality of its own. The leather of his uniform still bore oil stains from countless hours in cramped turrets, the fabric worn thin at the elbows from leaning over map tables in desperate planning sessions. His Panzer Brigade had been designated as the firefighting unit for the Western Front, rushed from crisis to crisis. On March 3rd, 3 days before the encounter at Cologne, Bartleborth attended a briefing at Field Marshal Walter Model's headquarters, where the bunker was thick with cigarette smoke and desperation. Model was reportedly frank about the arithmetic, telling his officers they faced an enemy who could lose 100 tanks on Monday and field 150 on Tuesday. The allocation for Panzer Brigade 106 was 12 replacement vehicles for March, 4 Panthers and 8 Panzer IVs, half of which were rebuilt from cannibalized wrecks. As his column prepared to defend Cologne on March 5th, Bartleborth issued desperate orders for every vehicle to be dug in as a static defense position, as the concept of mobile defense, the very essence of panzer warfare, had become impossible. That same morning, Colonel John Smith of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division recorded in his unit diary receiving replacement vehicles, 35 M4A3E8 Shermans with 76 mm guns, 12 M18 Hellcats, and 8 M36 Jacksons, more than they had lost the previous week, with storage areas congested with excess vehicles. March 6th, at 00 hours, brought the American assault on Cologne with an artillery barrage that shook the ground beneath Bartleborth's boots, making the cathedral's ancient stones tremble as American tanks fired at anything that might conceivably hide an enemy. At Cathedral Square, Bartleborth's Panther waited in ambush, hull down behind rubble with only the turret and gun visible. The first Sherman appeared at 1450 hours, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Karl Kellner, and the crack of Bartleborth's gun split the air as his 75 mm shell penetrated the Sherman's frontal armor with a shower of sparks, causing the tank to burst into flames and killing 3 crew members instantly. What happened next defied everything Bartleborth knew about armored warfare. Instead of withdrawing to reassess, the Americans simply pushed the burning Sherman aside with a dozer tank, metal scraping against metal, and continued advancing. Another Sherman appeared, then another, prompting Unteroffizier Klaus Müller to later testify to interrogators that they destroyed 3 Shermans in 5 minutes with perfect kills. Yet the Americans didn't even slow down. It was like trying to stop a river with bare hands. At 15:03 hours, Bartleborth's Panther faced something new as an approaching tank appeared larger and heavier with a longer gun than the usual Sherman, making the ground vibrate differently under its weight. He had never seen this model before. It was an M26 Pershing, America's new heavy tank nicknamed Eagle 7, commanded by Sergeant Robert Early with Corporal Clarence Smoyer as gunner. Bartleborth, experienced commander that he was, made one fatal error by mistaking the unfamiliar Pershing for a German tank and telling his gunner to hold fire. Those seconds of hesitation sealed his fate as the Pershing's 90 mm gun roared, striking Bartleborth's Panther in the side with a deafening clang before a second shell set the vehicle ablaze with black smoke billowing into the afternoon sky. Bartleborth and 3 crew members escaped through their hatches with singed uniforms, but the gunner died in the burning vehicle. To comprehend the shock of German tankers in 1945, one must understand Germany's tank situation. The Wehrmacht had entered the war with over 3,000 tanks, mostly light Panzers and IIs. But by 1945, despite producing increasingly sophisticated vehicles, they could barely maintain 1,500 operational tanks on all fronts. The Tiger II, weighing 70 tons and carrying the magnificent 88 mm gun, was a mechanical masterpiece, yet according to production records, only about 490 were ever built. The Panther, perhaps the best medium tank of the war, suffered from chronic transmission problems, the grinding of gears being a constant soundtrack in German tank units, and of approximately 6,000 produced, barely 400 were operational by March 1945. On the home front, German civilians hadn't seen new vehicles since 1943 as tank factories were relocated underground to escape bombing, with workers assembling vehicles in damp, poorly lit tunnels that echoed with the sounds of forced labor under conditions that would have appalled Henry Ford. 14-year-old Hitler Youth members were trained on wooden mock-ups, their hands gripping painted broomsticks instead of machine guns, while the United States was treating tank production like automobile manufacturing with the familiar smell of machine oil and fresh paint filling American factories running 3 shifts, and tank crews being trained on hundreds of surplus vehicles amid the rumble of engines at training grounds from Kentucky to California. With the Pershing victorious at the cathedral, Bartleborth's surviving crew members surrendered to advancing American forces, His uniform scorched him, and hands trembling from adrenaline as he watched more American armor roll past his burning Panther. Obergefreiter Hans Fischer wrote to his wife 3 days later that he had seen more American tanks in one morning than German tanks in 2 years of war. When they destroyed one, 2 appeared, and when they destroyed 5, 10 took their place. By evening on March 6th, American forces had cleared most of Cologne west of the Rhine, and the cathedral bell, silent for months, would soon ring again. German forces had destroyed 31 American tanks, but within 72 hours, all losses had been replaced with improved models, while German losses totaled 26 tanks, every operational vehicle in the sector irreplaceable. Colonel Hans von Luck, commanding the 21st Panzer Division remnants, arrived at Model's headquarters on March 8th with a stark assessment delivered in the command bunker's stale air of defeat. According to his memoirs, von Luck reported that the Americans were advancing with hundreds of tanks moving in columns like a peacetime parade. They destroyed 10, and the Americans didn't even notice. But when Germans lost one, it was a catastrophe. Field Marshal Model stared at the map showing American bridgeheads across the Rhine, with red pins marking American units covering the map like measles. The Americans had crossed at Remagen on March 7th, and within days had pushed 25 divisions across with an estimated 5,000 tanks, while Model had perhaps 90 operational tanks to defend all of Army Group B. He reportedly told his staff they faced an enemy who measured tank strength by divisions while Germans counted individual vehicles. Across the Reich, German tank crews were reaching similar conclusions as the ground trembled under American armor from the Ruhr to Bavaria. At Paderborn, Feldwebel Erich Weber of the 507th Heavy Tank Battalion watched American formations stretching to the horizon, their dust clouds visible for miles. Counting 400 tanks passing a single point in 1 hour, while his battalion had 6 operational Tiger IIs. The ability to mass-produce tanks was rooted in a manufacturing philosophy Germany never grasped. American tanks were designed for production, not perfection. The Sherman's transmission was less sophisticated than the Panther's, but could be mass-produced and easily replaced, while the gun was adequate rather than exceptional, but ammunition was unlimited, with brass casings littering American positions like autumn leaves. Colonel James Rose, Chief of Armor Development for the U.S. First Army, explained in a March 1945 report that Germans built tanks like Swiss watches while Americans built them like Detroit-built trucks, good enough, reliable enough, and in unlimited numbers. By late March 1945, as German forces were encircled in the Ruhr pocket, the disparity had become absolute, with the sound of American engines being inescapable, a constant mechanical drone that haunted German defenders. The U.S. Ninth Army alone fielded over 1,300 tanks, while the entire German Army Group B, 325,000 men, had fewer than 100 operational tanks. At Lippstadt on April 1st, when American forces completed the encirclement, German officers witnessed something that shattered their last illusions as the horizon turned black with American vehicles. Major Wilhelm Ritter of the 116th Panzer Division watched from a church tower. The bells long since melted for the war effort, later testifying that they had 11 tanks left hidden in barns while Americans drove past like Germans didn't exist, having so many tanks they didn't bother searching for the German ones. Even Bartleborth, recovering from burns in a field hospital, heard reports from the Ruhr pocket, as nurses whispered about endless American columns and German tanks being abandoned for lack of a few liters of fuel, while Americans ran their engines all night for warmth. The most telling incident occurred at Iserlohn on April 13th, when a depot of damaged German tanks, 43 Panthers and Tigers awaiting repair, was captured intact. The American commander surveyed the equipment and made a decision that epitomized the industrial imbalance, deciding not to bother securing them since they had 200 brand-new Pershings arriving the following week. By April 14th, as Model's forces began surrendering en masse, American tank crews were complaining about traffic jams in bitter irony, Germans destroying their tanks for lack of fuel while Americans were delayed by too many vehicles. Unteroffizier Hermann Gross of the 9th Panzer Division described the final days, saying they had 4 Panthers left, magnificent machines, but fuel for maybe 10 kilometers, while watching American convoys drive past all day with hundreds of vehicles running their engines constantly. On April 16th, General Gustaf von Zangen, commanding the German 15th Army, sent his final message before surrendering, stating they were being overwhelmed by an avalanche of steel as the enemy advanced with more tanks than they had anti-tank shells, calling it industrial extermination. During the Ruhr battle, American forces lost 341 tanks to all causes, but within 2 weeks had received 500 replacements, creating a devastating psychological impact. Every German soldier had his moment of recognition, as Gefreiter Friedrich Kuhn wrote that they were told they were the master race until he saw American tank parks with more vehicles than their entire army, including tanks they weren't even using, just parked in reserve. Hitler, informed of the collapse on April 17th, refused to acknowledge reality, and when shown aerial reconnaissance photos of American assembly areas, he reportedly claimed they were inflatable decoys. However, lower commanders knew the truth, as General Heinz Guderian had already told Hitler weeks earlier that Americans were producing more tanks in a month than Germany had built in the past year. The Ruhr pocket surrendered on April 18th, yielding 317,000 prisoners, including veterans who, like Bartleborth, had seen the future of warfare and knew their time had passed. Field Marshal Model, rather than surrender, shot himself in a forest on April 21st, his last words to his aide reportedly being, "What is left for a defeated general?" In ancient times, they took poison. In the prison camps, with their smell of defeat palpable through unwashed uniforms, medical alcohol, and resignation, German tank crews had time to reflect. Oberst Heinrich von Manstein told interrogators that their tactics were excellent and tanks superb with the best trained crews. But none of it mattered because Americans built tanks like newspapers, daily in impossible numbers. The interrogator, Major Robert Allen, recorded a revealing exchange when he asked von Manstein when he knew the war was lost, receiving the reply, March 1945, west of Cologne. "I saw American maintenance units throwing away entire engines because it was easier to install new ones while we were cannibalizing wrecks for individual bolts. That's not war, that's two different universes colliding." This knowledge spread through the camps as even Bartleborth, his burns healing slowly, understood the overwhelming mathematics. By war's end, the United States had produced approximately 88,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, deploying 16,000 tanks in the European theater alone, while having another 8,000 in the Pacific. The most damning statistic came from production efficiency. Building a King Tiger took German factories hundreds of thousands of man-hours, while Americans produced 3 Shermans in the same time. Dr. Karl Müller, a German economist, calculated that by March 1945, American tank production capacity exceeded German production by a factor of 4 to 1. In May 1945, as Germany surrendered, American forces found 2,100 abandoned German tanks while the U.S. Army had 11,000 operational tanks in Europe alone, already shipping older models to scrapyards. General George Patton, touring a captured facility where Bartleborth's Panther had been built, remarked that Germans built better tanks, but Americans built tanks better. Years later, Wilhelm Bartleborth's gunner, Gustaf Schaefer, survived the war and was interviewed in 1965, gray-haired with hands still bearing old burn scars. He explained that when people asked about tank battles, tactics, and courage, he told them they lost the moment American factories started producing tanks like sausages. Every Tiger was a masterpiece, taking 6 months, while every Sherman was adequate and took 3 hours. The lesson was brutal. In industrial warfare, the nation with the most factories wins. The Germans built the best tanks of World War II, but the Americans built the most. The Panther tank still sits in a museum in Cologne, meters from where Bartleborth made his last stand, with visitors asking why such a magnificent machine was defeated. The answer isn't in the tank, but in the production statistics on the wall behind it. Germany built 6,000 Panthers, while America built nearly 50,000 Shermans. In 1975, the U.S. Army's Armor School published a study concluding German tanks achieved a 3.5 to 1 kill ratio against American armor. But it didn't matter because Americans had a production ratio of 10-1. Colonel David Browning, who led a Sherman platoon through Germany, wrote that they knew their tanks were inferior and German crews were better trained, but they also knew they'd have new tanks tomorrow while Germans wouldn't. The final irony came post-war when German designers recruited by NATO praised German mechanical excellence while noting their complete unsuitability for mass production. Dr. Ferdinand Porsche admitted they designed tanks to win battles while Americans designed tanks to win the war. That morning in Cologne, when Bartleborth saw those endless columns and understood the impossibility of victory, was repeated across Germany in spring 1945 as each officer had their moment when they realized they weren't fighting an army, but an industrial system, craftsmen confronting automation, representing the past facing a future with unlimited tanks. The last German tank factory produced its final Tiger II on March 26, 1945. The same day, American factories produced 67 Sherman tanks, 23 tank destroyers, and 41 self-propelled guns. The Tiger II never saw combat, running out of fuel 20 kilometers from the factory and being abandoned, while the Americans who captured it didn't bother to move it. They had plenty of tanks already.